I only wanted shelter, but this iron clamp sounds like it remembers something.
He was 25 and evicted. No room, no repair kit, no family willing to answer, just a cracked leather strop and $12 he had earned honing a cook's razor. And with those $12, he bought a forgotten Razor-Strop shop near Baden in St. Louis County, Missouri, absent from commercial maps since 1978. Rain had opened a black seam along the roof. The rear brick wall leaned nearly 4 inches outward. The city had condemned the building in March 2001 and scheduled demolition for that autumn, but inside its stretching frame, an old handle clamp, concealed bank certificates, and a ledger that would tell Jude why the shop had been waiting for him. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Jude Barrett had been measuring his whole life without knowing it. As a boy in South St. Louis, he measured mornings by the groan of buses beyond the kitchen glass, and evenings by the moment his father's work lamp clicked on. Their apartment stood above a laundromat, and its floors trembled during the final spin cycle. Jude learned to sleep through the vibration, but he always woke when steel touched leather in the next room. His father, Malcolm Barrett, repaired barber tools at a narrow bench beside the radiator. He was neither tender nor severe. He simply believed that anything placed in his hands deserved to leave them straighter, cleaner, and more useful than it had arrived. On Saturdays, Malcolm took Jude to see Elias Bell, an elderly strop maker whose shop stood behind a barber supply warehouse on North Broadway. Elias wore a brown apron polished black at the stomach and kept his thumbnail long for testing the grain of leather. He taught Jude to cut straps along the hide's backbone, where the fibers ran most evenly, then dampen the edges with a sponge before burnishing them against a smooth piece of cocobolo. Their ritual never changed. Elias brewed chicory coffee in a blue enamel pot. Malcolm sharpened the cutting knives while Jude swept the bench and warmed a mixture of beeswax and neatsfoot oil near the stove. By noon, the room smelled of leather, hot metal, and the faint sweetness of wax. Elias would lay a finished strop across Jude's palms and make him pull gently from both ends, feeling for any place where the leather stretched unevenly. "A good strop does not sharpen steel," Elias once told him. "It reminds what shape it was meant to keep." Jude did not understand the sentence then. He remembered only the way Elias pressed 2 fingers against the leather, waiting for the material to answer before he released it. Malcolm died when Jude was 19, 3 months after a cough became a diagnosis. No one in the family could afford to misunderstand. The repair bench was dismantled. His mother sold the lamp and the wooden vise to cover the burial bill, but she left Jude a canvas roll containing 2 razors, 3 small hammers, a burnisher, and his father's oldest strop. Elias Bell had already been dead 4 years. His North Broadway shop had been cleared without notice, its tools scattered through an estate sale. Jude carried Malcolm's roll through 3 rented rooms and 7 temporary jobs. In the last apartment, he shared the lease with Trent Hale, a restaurant server who wore pressed shirts even on days he did not work. Trent kept the refrigerator shelves labeled and the thermostat locked inside a clear plastic case. He spoke softly when displeased, making each instruction sound like an arrangement already agreed upon. At first, Trent admired the repair kit. He brought Jude 2 razors from the restaurant kitchen and watched him clean rust from their spines. Then he began asking what the tools were worth. Jude stopped answering. He slid the canvas roll beneath his bed and placed his suitcase in front of it. On Thursday, October 3rd, Jude returned from an afternoon shift washing pans and found the suitcase moved. A pale rectangle marked the dust beneath the bed. The tool roll was gone. Trent's closet stood empty except for 1 wire hanger turning slowly above the carpet. On the kitchen counter lay a rent notice pinned beneath a ceramic ashtray. Trent had not paid his half for 2 months. He had also taken the cash Jude kept inside a flour tin. The landlord arrived carrying a red plastic milk crate for the keys. He listened without removing his cap, then set the crate beside the door. "You have until noon. Leave the key behind." Exactly 8 words. Jude counted them, because counting was steadier than pleading. He telephoned his mother from the laundromat downstairs. When he told her what Trent had taken, she became quiet. Jude heard a cupboard close and the scrape of a chair across linoleum. He asked whether he might sleep on her sofa for 1 week. The line remained open for 11 seconds. Then it went dead. At noon, Jude placed the apartment key in the red crate. He carried 1 change of clothes, his father's cracked strop, and $29.40. For the first week, he slept beneath the awning of a closed furniture store on Cherokee Street, rising before the delivery trucks arrived. $4 bought bread, canned beans, and a spoon from a church thrift shop. Rain drove him east, where he spent 2 nights sitting upright in the waiting room at the downtown bus station until a guard recognized him. He walked into East St. Louis and slept beneath a concrete approach near the Eads Bridge, wrapping the leather strop inside his shirt to keep the river damp from reaching it. His money fell to $18.12. In Granite City, a bakery owner let him sweep flour from the loading room in exchange for soup and 1 night beside the boiler. The next morning she paid him $3, though he had not asked. He traveled south again, sleeping behind a Mission on Locust Street, and once inside an unlocked delivery van that smelled of onions. He shaved in public washrooms, using disposable blades too dull to trust near his throat. Each time, he thought of the razors Trent had sold and the careful marks Malcolm had cut into their wooden cases. After 6 weeks, Jude possessed $12, the clothes he wore, and the strop. Its hide had dried into a shallow curve. Each evening he rubbed it between his palms, warming the leather before rolling it loosely beneath his coat. On November 15th, cold rain pushed him into the Central Library on Olive Street. He went first for heat, then for the drinking fountain. A librarian with silver eyeglass chains noticed him studying the employment board and placed a stack of discarded newspapers on the table without asking questions. Near the bottom of a municipal auction column, Jude found an advertisement printed in type so small that the ink had closed inside several letters. Abandoned commercial structure. Former leather Razor-Strop shop. Tax sale transfer, $12. Buyer assumes all repairs, lions, and demolition risk. The address was on Gimblin Road, beyond the streetcar lines he knew. Viewings were not offered. Payment had to be made in person at the county property office before 4 o'clock the following afternoon. Jude read the notice 3 times. Then he opened a city atlas and measured the route with the edge of his library card. Part of the journey could be made by bus. The final 9 miles would have to be walked. He copied the address onto the blank back of a due date slip. Before leaving, he returned the newspapers to a neat stack and thanked the librarian. Outside, the rain had thinned to a patient mist. By dawn, Jude was on the westbound bus with $12 in his pocket and no money for the return journey. The bus carried Jude as far as Clayton before its brakes sighed, and the driver pointed toward the pavement. A church had donated the fare, leaving all $12 untouched in his pocket. From there, the route on his due date slip ran northwest for nearly 14 miles, farther than the library atlas had suggested. He walked until afternoon, following Natural Bridge Road beneath a sky the color of unpolished pewter. His shoes softened in the rain, and the right sole began separating at the toe. After dark, he found an open hay barn beyond St. Anne and asked the owner, a broad woman carrying a kerosene lantern, whether he might sleep under the overhang. "Inside," she said. "The wind turns after midnight." The temperature fell to 28 degrees. Jude burrowed between 2 square bales, keeping his father's strop beneath his shirt. Hay dust caught in his throat, while mice worked somewhere inside the wall. He slept in pieces and rose before the woman returned, leaving the barn door latched as he had found it. By 9 the next morning, he reached the small business district of Coldwater. He passed Pruitt's Cafe, Gable Shoe Repair, North County Feed and Seed, Bellwether Pharmacy, and a hardware store called Harlan and Sons, though the gold lettering beneath the name said, "Established 1946. The buildings stood close to the road, their brick fronts darkened by decades of truck exhaust. The county property office occupied 2 rooms above Bellwether Pharmacy. A narrow stairway smelled of floor wax and wet wool. Jude climbed slowly, pressing his separated shoe sole down with each step. Inside, a ceiling fan turned without moving much air. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall, and a brass rail divided the public counter from 3 desks. Only one clerk was present. She had iron-gray hair gathered with 2 crossed pencils and wore a navy cardigan buttoned to the throat. The nameplate on her desk read, "Mrs. Loretta Farrell, Property Transfers." Jude placed the newspaper clipping on the counter. "I came about the Strop shop." Mrs. Farrell studied his wet coat, his mud-darkened cuffs, and finally, the clipping. She opened a drawer and removed a buff folder tied with cotton tape. "You understand the property is condemned?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no water service?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the city may still order demolition?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the $12 cannot be refunded?" "Yes, ma'am." She untied the folder. Inside lay a survey, 4 inspection reports, and a photograph of a low brick building almost hidden behind weeds. The roof had sagged since the picture was taken. Someone had drawn a red line beside the rear wall and written "structural movement" in block letters. Mrs. Farrell slid a transfer form toward him. Legal name, Jude Malcolm Barrett. Her pencil stopped. She looked first at Jude, then at the folder. From beneath the inspection reports, she removed a yellow envelope, softened at the corners. Malcolm Barrett was written across it in black ink. "Your father repaired barber tools." Jude did not touch the envelope. He did. "And you spent Saturdays with Elias Bell." The fan clicked once during each slow rotation. Jude heard 3 clicks before he answered. "How do you know that?" Mrs. Farrell turned the envelope over. A county receipt was stapled to the back, dated August 19th, 1999. Malcolm had paid the minimum preservation filing fee on the building, then written twice, asking that demolition be delayed. The second letter identified him as a former apprentice of Elias Bell. "This shop belonged to Mr. Bell before he moved his work to North Broadway," she said. "Your father tried to protect it. He never completed the transfer." "Why not?" "The county required $700 in back taxes then." Mrs. Farrell placed one finger on the newer auction sheet. After the roof failure, the tax board reduced the value to the administrative minimum, $12. Jude looked at the blurred photograph again. Elias had never mentioned another shop. Malcolm had never mentioned saving one. Mrs. Farrell did not offer the envelope. It belonged to the file, and her hand remained over it with the quiet firmness of someone who had guarded records longer than most people guarded memories. "Do you still want the property?" Jude counted 12 bills onto the counter. 6 were singles, softened by rain and handling. 1 bore a blue ink stain across Washington's face. Mrs. Farrell checked each bill, then signed beneath his name. She carried the deed to a side table, positioned it beneath a brass lever press, and pulled the handle down. The stamp struck with a heavy, exact sound. When she raised it, the county seal stood bright in the paper. She gave him directions, slowly. "Take Lindbergh Boulevard north for 3 2/10 miles. Turn right on Old Halls Ferry Road. Past the Lutheran Cemetery. Then continue 8/10 of a mile beyond the Coldwater Creek Bridge. At the second gravel lane, look for 3 walnut trees and a rusted mailbox without a door." The shop stood behind them. "The lane used to be called Gimblin Road," she said. "The county stopped maintaining it years ago." Jude folded the deed once and slipped it beneath his shirt beside the strop. Mrs. Farrell watched him reach the door. "Mr. Barrett?" He turned. She opened her top drawer and placed the blue-stained dollar inside it, rather than with the other county receipts. "Your father came here 4 times, she said. "He always asked whether the building was still standing." Outside, the rain had ended. Jude walked north along Lindbergh, then cut toward Old Hall's Ferry Road, where traffic pushed cold air against his coat. The clouds lifted enough to reveal a narrow band of pale afternoon above the warehouses. Near the creek bridge, he met a man repairing a wire fence. The man wore one leather glove and held the missing glove in his teeth while tightening a staple. A red hound watched Jude from beside the fence, its tail moving once against the dead grass. "You looking for Bell's place?" the man asked. Jude nodded. The man pointed with his hammer. "Past my walnut trees. Dog'll bark, but she won't follow." The hound followed for 40 yards. Beyond the 3rd walnut tree, the gravel dissolved into weeds. Jude found the mailbox, then a pair of stone gateposts, nearly swallowed by honeysuckle. The building appeared only after he stepped between them. It was longer than the photograph suggested, perhaps 24 feet wide and 40 feet deep, built of red St. Louis brick, laid 3 courses thick. A low gabled roof sagged above the center beam. Rolled tar paper had peeled back from this western slope, exposing gray boards beneath. The chimney rose at the rear, square and soot black, with 3 missing bricks near its cap. A wooden sign hung above the door from one rusted chain. "Bell Leather Strops, Repair and Finish." The second chain had broken, leaving the sign tilted like a scale, holding unequal weight. Jude stood beneath it until the red hound barked from the road. Then he fitted the county key into the brass padlock. The shackle resisted. He warmed it between his hands, pulled upward to relieve the pressure, and turned again. This time, the lock opened. The door dragged across the floor, pushing a ridge of mouse droppings and plaster dust. Air moved past him, carrying the dry mineral smell of brick, mildew, and leather, too old to remain supple. Somewhere in the rear room, water fell at measured intervals into metal. Light entered through 2 clouded windows. It revealed a front counter, 3 stools with split leather seats, and narrow shelves where pale rectangles marked the places boxes had once stood. Jude ran a finger across the counter. The dust felt as fine as flour, but beneath it, the walnut surface remained smooth. He heard pigeons shifting above the ceiling. When he stepped farther inside, one wing struck a rafter, and the sudden beating filled the room. Jude bent instinctively, then stood still until the bird settled. The back room was colder. A hand-operated stretching frame stood bolted to the floor, its iron screw furred with rust. Long leather straps hung from ceiling pegs, hardened into twists. A cutting table leaned toward one corner where a roof leak had blackened the boards. Beside it stood a cast-iron stove no taller than Jude's knee. He touched one hanging strap. It cracked beneath the light pressure of his thumb and released a smell he knew immediately. Old oak-tanned hide, dust, and the faint, bitter trace of dressing oil. The dripping came from a tin wash basin beneath the roof seam. Jude dipped one finger into it and tasted only enough to confirm rust and rain. His stomach tightened at the cold metallic flavor. In a cupboard, he found a paper packet of salt fused into a solid block. There was no food, no clean water, and no blanket. Yet the rear door still latched. The chimney appeared open. One corner of the front room remained dry. Before darkness, Jude swept that corner with a broom worn down to uneven bristles. He laid flattened cardboard from the storeroom across the floor, removed his damp coat, and placed the deed inside it. His separated shoe sole, he bound with a narrow strip cut from the cracked end of his father's strop. Night settled early. Cold traveled upward through the boards and entered him wherever bone touched the floor. Through the broken roof seam, he could see one star between moving clouds. Jude reached out in the dark until his fingers found the leg of the stretching frame. The iron was cold, fixed, and real. It reminds the edge what shape it was meant to keep. At first light, Jude began learning what the deed had given him. The well stood 30 paces behind the shop beneath a collapsed pump shelter. Its iron handle moved, but the leather cup inside the cylinder had dried beyond use. Jude tied the tin wash basin to a length of cord and lowered it through the open casing. At 21 feet, metal touched water. He drew up a shallow measure, strained it through his handkerchief, and boiled it before drinking. The outhouse leaned toward the creek, though its cedar seat remained sound and the roof admitted only a narrow blade of daylight. Jude braced the door with a fallen brick. It was a small repair, but completing it gave the morning an edge he could hold. For 3 days, he moved slowly through the building. He learned which floorboard complained beside the counter, which one answered near the stove, and which soft plank had to be crossed along its joist. The shop possessed a language of pressure, a short click near the front door, a hollow knock beneath the cutting table, and a long wooden sigh whenever he approached the stretching frame. He marked dangerous boards with pieces of white plaster. Rainwater supplied washing water. For drinking, he walked to Pruitt's Cafe, where the owner filled his jar from the kitchen tap without asking for payment. On the 3rd morning, she added a boiled egg wrapped in waxed paper. Jude carried the egg to Harlan & Sons Hardware. The store was narrow and deep, with ladders suspended from ceiling hooks and rows of wooden drawers labeled in fading black script. It smelled of rope, machine oil, and the iron warmth of the floor furnace. A brass bell trembled above the door after Jude entered. The owner emerged from behind a tower of stovepipe elbows. Owen Harlan had a white crescent scar passing through his left eyebrow, and the habit of rubbing that scar whenever he considered a problem. Jude explained the chimney, the roof opening, and the $12 deed. He did not mention Malcolm or Elias. He placed the boiled egg on the counter while he spoke, unwilling to eat in front of a stranger. Owen listened, then opened a ruled account book. "How much money have you got?" "None." "Any regular work?" "Not yet." "Then what are you offering?" Jude removed the repaired strip from his shoe and set his father's strop beside it. "I know leather. I can sweep, unload freight, sharpen knives, or repair whatever I understand." Owen lifted the strop and bent it gently between both hands. His thumb paused over Malcolm's stamped initials. "Barrett?" Jude nodded. Owen closed the account book, turned it around, and pointed to a blank line. "Write your name. Keep every receipt. Work Saturdays until the balance is square." Jude signed. For the chimney, Owen supplied a 6-inch wire brush for $3.25, stove cement for $1.10, lamp oil for 68 cents, a sack of flour for 29 cents, and dried beans for 41 cents. He added work gloves, a coil of rope, 2 candles, and a dented saucepan, without calling out their cost. From beneath the counter, he brought out a green cloth-bound volume titled Repairs for the Owner-Built House. "Last edition, anyone could understand," he said. "Bring it back dry." "That goes on the account?" "That goes back on my shelf." Jude carried everything to the shop in a wooden nail box. He ate the egg while walking, saving the waxed paper for kindling. The chimney took 6 hours. He first disconnected the rusted stovepipe and covered the stove opening with a damp cloth. On the roof, he tied the brush to the rope, weighted its lower end with an iron nut, and lowered it through the flue. The first pass stopped less than 4 feet down. Jude worked the brush with short upward pulls until a black plate of creosote broke loose and fell into the firebox. He repeated the motion, turning the rope 1/4 turn after each descent. Soot entered his sleeves and gathered behind his ears. Twice, the brush lodged at the smoke shelf. Each time, he climbed down, reached through the stove opening with a bent strip of iron, and loosened the obstruction from below. The final deposit came free shortly before dusk. It was as thick as roofing felt and curved like a piece of broken pottery. Jude carried every fragment outside in the saucepan, then inspected the flue with a mirror angled beneath the opening. A clean ribbon of gray daylight reached the firebox. He packed stove cement around the loose collar, waited until it skinned over, and twisted newspaper beneath 3 dry walnut branches. The first match failed. The second produced a thin flame that leaned toward the chimney. Smoke drew upward. Jude fed the fire 1 branch at a time. The stove clicked as its iron warmed, releasing the smell of old ash and dust. He boiled well water for 20 minutes, poured in beans he had soaked since morning, and thickened the broth with flour. The meal had no meat and almost no salt, yet steam warmed his face while he ate beside the stove. It was his first hot supper beneath a roof in more than 6 weeks. The following morning, Jude began the workroom inventory. He chose only objects that might still serve. There was a head knife with 1 horn broken from its handle, a lignum vitae burnisher, darkened by years of palms, a cast-iron glue pot nested inside a water jacket, a brass draw gauge frozen at 3 inches, 2 boxes of copper rivets green at their edges, a maple pattern board holding 6 strop outlines, a sandstone dressing block, and the floor-mounted stretching frame. The frame demanded the longest inspection. Its oak rails were gray with dirt but free of rot. An iron screw passed through the upper crosspiece and ended in a handle clamp made to grip a doubled leather tab. The clamp was unusually broad, nearly the width of Jude's hand, and heavier than its purpose required. He brushed the frame clean and turned the screw. Rust protested along the threads. After several deliberate turns, the clamp descended by 1/2 inch. Something moved inside it. The sound was not loose rust. It was a muted slide followed by a small, dense knock. Jude removed the clamp pin and lifted the assembly from the screw. According to the maple pattern board, the clamp should have weighed perhaps 2 pounds. This one pulled downward with twice that force. He balanced it across his forearm, then compared it with a second clamp found beneath the bench. The difference was unmistakable. He tapped both pieces with the wooden handle of the head knife. The ordinary clamp answered with a clear iron ring. The mounted clamp gave a shortened note, as though its center had been packed with cloth. Jude set it on the cutting table. Beneath a skin of hardened wax, he found 4 small screws. Their slots were filled with black dressing compound. He softened the compound with warm water, cleared each slot using a harness needle, and backed the screws out a 1/4 turn at a time. The bottom plate did not release. He warmed the edges near the stove, never allowing the iron to become hotter than his hand could bear. A seam gradually appeared. Jude inserted the broken horn of the head knife and applied light pressure. The plate rose enough for him to grip it. Inside the clamp was a cedar disc cut precisely to the iron cavity. One face bore the same small, bell-shaped craft mark stamped into Malcolm's strop. Jude smelled the cedar before he lifted it. The scent remained sharp beneath the wax, dry and clean against the heavier odor of leather. 2 finger notches had been carved into the disc. He pulled evenly. A narrow chamber extended through the hollow clamp and into the upper iron sleeve of the stretching frame. The first package was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with linen thread. Jude placed it on the table without opening it and removed a second, then a third. Behind them rested a rectangular tin box sealed around its lid with dark red wax. He closed the shop door and checked the rear latch. The first oilcloth bundle held tools fitted so tightly together that none had shifted. 3 polished awls, a narrow paring knife, a wheel creaser, and a small hammer with one flat face and one rounded face. Elias Bell had been stamped into each wooden handle. Beneath them lay Malcolm's missing brass edge gauge. Jude held the gauge near the window. A shallow nick crossed its beam where he had dropped it as a boy. Malcolm had made him polish away the raised burr while leaving the mark itself. The second bundle contained rolled calfskin, black on one side and undyed on the other. The hide remained flexible. Waxed paper separated each layer, and cedar shavings protected it from insects. A handwritten tag described the tannage and warned that the grain should be burnished dry before any dressing was applied. Inside the third package lay a barber ledger bound in cracked brown leather. Jude opened only the cover. The first visible page listed names, shop addresses, fire dates, and repairs marked no charge. Several entries identified apprentices whose razors and strops had been damaged in boarding house or barbershop fires. The tin box resisted until Jude warmed the wax and cut around the lid with the paring knife. Bank certificates filled most of the interior, folded into linen sleeves. He laid them on the table by the institution and maturity date, checking each serial number twice. Their face values totaled exactly $43,900. Beneath the certificates rested a cotton purse containing an Indian head cent, a barber dime, a Liberty head nickel, and 2 Morgan silver dollars. Jude arranged the coins by size, but did not add them to the certificates. They had been wrapped around a bronze medal suspended from a faded rainbow ribbon. It was a World War I victory medal. The edge had been engraved, Thomas Bell Stee, Mihail 1908. At the bottom of the box lay an envelope addressed in the same deliberate hand that had labeled the calfskin. For the one who opens the clamp. Jude did not read it. He returned the certificates to their linen sleeves and placed the medal over them. The ledger, tools, leather, and sealed envelope went back into the clamp chamber. He replaced the cedar disc, but left the bottom plate on the table. Darkness had gathered beyond the windows. The stove had gone out, yet Jude felt too confined to relight it. He walked past the walnut trees to Coldwater Creek. Rain had raised the current until it pressed brown water around the bridge pilings. Leaves turned in the eddies, circling twice before the main flow drew them onward. Jude stood there with the unopened letter inside his coat and watched the water choose every available path through the dark. It reminds the edge what shape it was meant to keep. Morning entered through the front windows in 2 pale columns. Jude relit the stove, heated water, and set the envelope beside the saucepan. When he finally lifted it, he recognized the narrow capitals. They matched the labels Elias Bell had written on leather scraps during those long Saturdays on North Broadway. The seal opened without tearing. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, you removed the clamp without breaking it. That tells me more about you than a name could. Impatient hands would have struck the iron. Careful hands listened. In April 2011, Dr. Miriam Shaw at Barnes Jewish Hospital in St. Louis told me I had pulmonary fibrosis. By then, I could no longer climb a roof, carry a hide, or work long enough to bring this building back. I had kept its taxes current when I could, but illness reduced the years before it reduced my breath. You should know whose floor you stand upon. Silas Bell came to St. Louis in 1869 and opened this shop in 1896. His daughter Ruth Bell was born here in 1878 and learned every bench before women were welcomed at the trade. Ruth married Daniel Barrett in 1906. Their son Samuel Barrett, born in 1910, taught leather repair to his grandson Malcolm, born in 1964. Malcolm taught his son Jude. If Jude is not the one reading this, then the line has traveled farther than I could follow. Silas's son Thomas left this bench for France and died after the Battle of St. Mihiel in 1918. His medal came home. He did not. Ruth kept the shop working, though suppliers addressed their letters to a man who had been buried. The Razor-Strop trade closed here on October 14, 1978. I moved what work remained to North Broadway. This room then stood silent for more than 30 years. Malcolm tried to save it, but I asked him to care for his family first. He obeyed me, though neither of us liked the cost. The certificates are not payment for grief. They are stored labor. Use them only where labor continues. If you make strops again, cut along the backbone and allow no more than 1/8 inch of wander over 30 inches. Warm dressing to 95 degrees. Never enough to darken the grain. Mix 2 parts neat's foot oil with 1 part beeswax and apply less than the leather appears to need. Stretch calfskin for 12 hours, release it for 1, then test the draw against a razor spine before attaching the handle clamp. The ledger matters more than the money. After shop fires, Ruth and Silas repaired tools free for apprentices because a worker without tools becomes dependent on whoever owns them. Read the names. Inheritance is not what rests in a box. It is what one pair of hands preserves long enough for another pair to begin. Behind the rear door, beneath the lowest sandstone step, you will find Ruth's bell mark. Do not remove it. It is the first signature this shop ever had. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here, Elias Nathaniel. Bell, October 14, 2012. Jude read the letter twice. During the second reading, he held Malcolm's brass edge gauge in his left hand and followed every line with his right forefinger. Then he folded the pages along their original creases, pressing each one flat with the side of his thumb. He opened the rear door. Dead grass brushed the threshold, silver with frost. 3 sandstone steps descended towards the well path. Jude knelt beside the lowest one and cleared away moss with a wooden splint. Near its underside, sheltered from decades of weather, a small bell had been carved into the stone. A narrow leather strap crossed its center. The mark matched the cedar disc, Malcolm's strop, and the old tools inside the clamp. Jude did not pry at the stone. He washed the carving with warm water, using a worn shaving brush from the backroom cupboard. As the dirt released, the cut lines deepened. He dried the mark with the cloth that had wrapped Elias's awls, then returned inside before his wet fingers stiffened. Above the cutting table, a shallow wall cabinet had been painted shut. Jude worked around its edge with the paring knife and opened it carefully. Inside stood a brass task lamp with a green glass shade. S. Bell had been scratched beneath its base. He trimmed the wick, filled the reservoir with Owen's lamp oil, and struck a match. A patient circle of green-tinted light settled over the bench. It reached the draw gauge, the burnisher, the calfskin rolls, and the open ledger. Beyond that circle, the room remained dim, but no longer abandoned. Jude read the first pages of the ledger. Beside each apprentice's name, Ruth Bell had recorded the tool, the damage, the hours required, and the charge forgiven. One razor had survived a boarding house fire with its horn scales burned away. Another apprentice had lost everything except a steel spine recovered from the ashes. Ruth had repaired both. The entries made Jude consider the smaller accounts that no courthouse preserved. May Kessler had opened her hay barn when the temperature fell. Loretta Farrell had delayed her lunch to stamp a deed and kept Malcolm's letters safe inside a county folder. Doris Pruitt had filled a stranger's jar and wrapped an egg in waxed paper. Owen Harlan had opened a credit account after Jude plainly said he owned nothing. None of them had solved his life. Each had placed one usable thing within reach of his hands. Before we move forward, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they could not have known how badly you needed it. Was it a meal, a ride, a dry place to sit, or simply a person who believed your word? Tell us in the comments if you would like to honor them by remembering it. That afternoon, Jude copied the certificate numbers onto the ledger's final blank page. He returned every document to its linen sleeve and carried the tin box to the county bank, where a manager confirmed that verification would take time. Jude asked for no advance. He took only a written receipt and walked back to the shop before sunset. The temperature dropped after dark. He fed the stove with fallen walnut wood, boiled another pan of beans, and cleaned Elias's tools one at a time. He removed corrosion with oil and cloth rather than abrasive paper, preserving every mark left by the hands before his. When the fire lowered, Jude spread his cardboard beside the stretching frame. He wrapped the calfskin and tool roll in oilcloth, placed the ledger beneath his folded coat, and set Malcolm's edge gauge near his shoulder. For the first time since the eviction, the objects beside him had not been gathered for escape. They had been arranged for mourning. Snow began on December 2nd and continued through the afternoon, laying 4.5 inches across Gimblin Road. Jude woke when meltwater struck the tin basin beside the cutting table. Above him, the roof seam had widened, and one exposed board bent beneath the snow's weight. He read the roofing chapter in Owen's green manual 3 times. Then he measured the building, 24 feet across, 40 feet long, with 2 slopes rising 12 feet from eave to ridge. Allowing for overlap and waste, he calculated 26 squares of asphalt shingles, 6 rolls of felt, and 60 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. The bank certificates had been verified, but Jude withdrew only enough to make the structure safe. He recorded the amount in Elias's ledger before ordering materials. Owen delivered the first bundles in his hardware truck. Beneath the seat, he found a roofing hatchet with a checkered face and a leather grip darkened by sweat. "My brother carried this 30 years, Owen said. "He died last spring. A tool should not spend winter beneath a truck seat." Jude accepted it with both hands. The former roofer arrived that afternoon. Amos Pike was 71, narrow as a fence paling, with white eyebrows that extended beyond the corners of his eyes. The neighbor with the red hound had told him someone was preparing to climb Bell's roof alone. Jude offered to pay. Amos looked at the sagging ridge, then at Jude's separated shoe held together with leather. "Pay attention," he said. "That will cover it." They stripped the western slope first. Beneath the failed tar paper, 2 rafters had rotted where water traveled along an old nail. Jude cut away only the damaged wood. Amos showed him how to sister each rafter with a new board, extending 3 feet beyond the weak section, secured through soundwood on both sides. They worked 11 days. Each morning, Jude swept frost from the roof and snapped a blue chalk line across the felt. Amos taught him to seat a roofing nail in 3 strokes, the first to place it, the second to drive it, the third to make the head lie flat without cutting the shingle. "That nail's proud. Set it lower." Jude struck again. Amos shook his head. "Pull it." Bent nails split old wood. By December 14th, the ridge lay straight against a clear sky. Jude installed the final cap shingle while Amos watched from the ladder. That evening, snow melt ran down both slopes and dropped beyond the brick walls. Nothing fell into the basin. January exposed the chimney's deeper damage. The upper 6 courses contained spalling bricks, whose faces separated in thin red flakes. Mortar beneath them had turned to powder. When Jude pressed a joint with his thumb, it collapsed like dry flour. He dismantled the loose courses 1 brick at a time, numbering reusable pieces in chalk. Owen helped him locate matching St. Louis brick from a demolished smokehouse. For the exterior joints, Jude mixed 3 parts washed sand with 1 part hydraulic lime. Around the flue liner, where heat demanded a different bond, he used 3 parts fire clay to 1 part refractory cement. The work lasted 3 weeks, most of it in temperatures in the 20s. Gloves protected him from the brick edges, but reduced his feel for the mortar. He removed them for the final tooling of each joint. His bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. When that happened, he climbed down, held them near the stove without touching the iron, and waited until pain returned to his fingertips. Amos came twice but never climbed. He stood below with his chin raised, studying the vertical joints. "Too wet," he called once. Jude scraped out the course and mixed it again. On January 27th, the final mortar had cured long enough for a test. Jude warmed the flue with a twist of burning newspaper, then built a small fire from dry walnut. Smoke rose without hesitation. Outside, Amos watched a clean gray thread leave the chimney and dissolve above the bare trees. He tipped 2 fingers toward his cap and walked home before Jude could thank him. The floors came next. The original boards were white pine, face-nailed with hand-cut rose-head nails. In the front room, their surface had darkened beneath wax, dirt, and a century of boots. Jude reset every raised nail with a narrow punch, working along the joists so the brittle tongues would not split. Owen rented him a random orbit sander for $14 per day. Jude made 3 passes, 80 grit to remove the failed finish, 120 to level the scratches, and 220 to close the surface without polishing it beyond the oil's reach. At the walls, he used a cabinet scraper and followed the grain by hand. The work changed the floor from dull brown to dark honey. After 3 thin coats of tung oil, each wiped free of excess after 20 minutes, the boards deepened toward mahogany. Jude waited 48 hours after the final coat before replacing the counter and stools. There was one morning when he did nothing. He had awakened before dawn with Malcolm's brass gauge clenched in his hand and Trent's empty closet fixed behind his eyes. He dressed, opened the shop, and stood beside the sander without connecting its cord. Then he walked to Coldwater Creek. A great blue heron stood in the marsh grass beyond the bridge, its legs nearly invisible in the reflected sky. Jude watched it remain motionless through wind, truck noise, and the slow movement of water. Once, it lowered its head, as though preparing to strike, then chose not to. Jude stayed until afternoon. He performed no work that day and did not record the hours as lost. By February, the roof and chimney held, but the windows admitted cold air from every direction. The shop had 8 wooden sashes. 3 contained no glass. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The final window held one wavering pane scratched with a glazier's date, 1788. The pane had been salvaged from an older riverfront workshop and installed when Silas built the shop. Its bubbles bent the walnut trees into long, green curves during summer and black ribbons during winter. Jude decided it would remain. He removed each sash and laid it flat across the cutting table. Old putty came away with gentle heat and a narrow chisel. He cleaned the rabbets, brushed them with boiled linseed oil, and bedded the replacement glass in DAP 33 glazing putty. Each glazier's point entered the wood sideways beneath the pressure of his putty knife. The counterweights had fallen inside the wall pockets. Jude opened the access panels and threaded 1/4-inch cotton sash cord over each pulley. At the weight, he tied a figure-8 knot large enough to hold without crushing the fibers. He adjusted each cord until the sash remained wherever his hand released it. Doris Pruitt brought coffee on the 4th morning and found Jude balancing the preserved pane across 2 folded blankets. She set the cup down without speaking and held the lower corner while he eased the sash into place. The old glass caught her reflection, dividing it gently around one trapped bubble. "This room remembers faces," she said. On the last window, Jude pressed the final line of putty into a smooth, 45-degree bevel. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch close enough for him to see its claws close around the bark. He paused with the knife in his hand. The bird leaned toward the restored glass, inspected its own small reflection, and flew across the creek. The sash remained open behind it, balanced on new cord and waiting for Jude's touch. Late February brought a softer cold and exposed the damage around the chimney. Horsehair plaster still clung to hand-split oak lath across most of the rear wall, but 3 patches failed when Jude tried to key new material into the old surface. The first sagged overnight, the second cracked where the bricks warmed, the third released in one complete piece and broke across the floor. Owen brought him a paper bag of horsehair left from his father's repair work. Jude washed it, cut it into short fibers, and mixed it through lime plaster until the material held together when lifted on the trowel. He dampened the lath before applying a scored scratch coat. Over that went a 3/8-inch brown coat, which cured beneath damp cloth for 72 hours. The final coat was 1/8 inch thick, worked with a wooden float until its surface matched the surrounding wall. Under the green task lamp, the new plaster remained lighter than the old work, its edges visible but honest. These patches will hold another 100 years. Jude spoke the sentence quietly, not as a boast, but as a standard. Doris Pruitt began leaving paper bags beside the rear door. Sometimes they held biscuits wrapped in a clean towel. Sometimes there was stew in a lidded jar or coffee grounds folded inside waxed paper. Jude carried the empty containers back to the cafe and placed money beside them. Doris always returned it. "In candles when the shop reopens," she said. A week later, 19-year-old Caleb Sutter arrived on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was long-limbed, with one front tooth turned slightly sideways. Without introducing himself, he began dividing the fallen walnut limbs into stove lengths. Jude offered him a day's wage. Caleb shook his head and drove them all through another round. "My mother said, 'About your grandfather.' That was all." He stacked the wood beneath the eave, tightened the bicycle chain with Jude's borrowed wrench, and rode away before dusk. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his walk to Coldwater Creek. He had the silver beard trimmed square beneath his chin and carried no umbrella, even in rain. At first he only tipped his hat. Then one morning he stopped while Jude reset a loose doorstep. The Reverend placed 2 fingers against the old sandstone. "Keep these hands steady." He continued down the lane. The prayer had taken 4 words and required no answer. Jude had postponed the cellar until February 11th. Its door lay beneath the rear workbench, concealed by a sheet of warped plywood. 7 granite steps descended into a room 12 feet wide and 15 feet long. The floor was made of fieldstone set directly into earth, with narrow channels cut toward a drain near the creek wall. At the center rested a dressed granite slab, unlike the rough stones around it. A bell crossed by a leather strap had been carved into its surface. Jude tested the edges with his fingertips, but did not insert a tool beneath them. Some closures deserved to remain closed until their purpose became clear. Under the 3rd step, his lamp revealed a small oak box wedged between granite and mortar. Jude loosened it by hand. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped like the hanging loop at the end of a Razor-Strop. Beneath the key was a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the shop before the walnut trees had grown thick. She wore a dark work apron and held a head knife against her hip. Her eyes, brow, and narrow jaw resembled Jude so closely that he placed the picture beside the cellar lamp and studied his reflection in the glass. On the back, a careful inscription read, "Ruth Bell, daughter of Silas Bell, age 25, summer of 1903. Jude carried the box upstairs. The tintype went beside the ledger, protected between 2 sheets of acid-free paper. The brass key remained on the mantel above the stove. He did not know what had opened. During March, snow withdrew from the lane in gray strips. Coldwater Creek grew loud enough to be heard from the workbench, and pale walnut catkins appeared beyond the restored windows. Jude sharpened Elias's paring knife and prepared small pieces of scrap hide. But he decided not to begin a complete strop that spring. The old calfskin had waited too long to be used by hands still learning their pressure. He would spend $1 Morgan on fresh leather and practice on samples no longer than 6 inches. He would cut, burnish, dress, stretch, and discard each failure without pretending it was ready. The house was patient. So was he. 2 winters later, on December 8th, 2024, Jude finished his first complete Razor-Strop. The leather came from the shoulder of an oak-tanned steer hide, cut 30 inches long and 2.5 inches wide. He had rejected 3 straps for wandering grain before choosing it. After burnishing, he applied the beeswax mixture so thinly that the surface appeared unchanged until held beneath the lamp. He stretched it for 12 hours, released it for 1, and attached Elias's restored handle clamp with copper rivets set against a steel backing plate. The final test came beneath his father's straight razor. Jude drew the spine across the leather and felt an even resistance from heel to point. No catch, no loose place. He stamped the back with a small bell crossed by a strap. Beneath it, he added 1 letter, B. The restored interior had become quieter rather than newer. White pine floors reflected the green lamp. 8 windows held the weather outside without erasing it. The walnut counter showed old knife marks beneath fresh oil, and the stretching frame remained bolted where Silas had placed it. Jude had added a narrow bed in the rear room, a sink connected to the repaired well, and shelves for leather. Nothing stood there merely for display. The brass key waited on the mantel until the following spring. A windstorm brought down one of the oldest walnut limbs. When Jude and Caleb cut the broken wood away, they found a rectangular brass plate beneath a fold of bark on the trunk's northern side. The tree had grown around its edges without covering the small keyhole at its center. Jude brought the key from the mantel. It turned once. Behind the plate was a dry cavity lined with cedar. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag and an envelope tied with blue thread. The flag was small enough to have hung in the shop window. Its cotton field faded where daylight had reached it before the tree concealed it. The letter was from Ruth Bell, dated October 6, 1918, while American forces were fighting in France. Silas had received word that Thomas was missing after St. Mihiel. Ruth wrote that her father could no longer bear to see the flag above the bench, yet could not throw it away or place it in a drawer among unpaid bills. She had wrapped it and chosen the walnut because Thomas planted the tree before leaving St. Louis. If he returns, she wrote, he will know where to find it. If he does not, the tree will keep what we could not carry each day. The official notice of Thomas Bell's death arrived 3 weeks later. Ruth never reopened the compartment. The tree thickened around the plate, protecting the flag through storms, abandonment, and more than a century of winters. Jude cleaned neither the cloth nor the envelope. A textile conservator at the Missouri History Museum showed him how to support the flag on acid-free tissue and store it without forcing the original folds flat. Jude paid for the materials, but declined the museum's offer to exhibit it. It belongs near the bench, he said. On September 12, 2024, the anniversary of the opening of the St. Mihiel offensive, Jude carried Thomas's victory medal to Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. A cemetery historian had located Thomas's memorial record, though his body had never returned from France. Jude laid the medal beneath the name for 1 quiet hour. Before leaving, he placed the medal back in its cotton wrapping. Honor did not require abandoning the object to weather. The certificates had matured at different times and could not all be treated alike. Jude hired an accountant, paid the delayed taxes, and created a repair trust attached to the building, rather than to his personal name. Only 4 certificates were redeemed. 1 for the roof and chimney, 1 for plumbing and safe electrical work, 1 for leather and hand tools, and one to establish the trust. The remaining certificates, all 5 old coins, and a copy of the ledger were sealed inside the handle clamp. Across the linen wrapper, Jude wrote 2 words: "The next one." He did not advertise the shop. Instead, Doris placed an index card on the corkboard beside the cafe register. Hand-finished Razor-Strop's repair. Before replacement, ask Doris. For Jude's address, the first request came from a retired barber in Ferguson whose strop had belonged to his uncle. The second arrived by mail from Alton, Illinois. Within 4 months, Jude kept a handwritten list of 43 names, though he completed only 2 or 3 orders each week. Anyone willing to wait received a place on the list. Anyone needing a working tool to earn income moved quietly to the front. The ledger resumed. Jude copied Ruth's columns: name, tool, damage, hours, charge. Besides several entries, he wrote "no charge." He never explained the decision, and the apprentices who received the work were not asked to perform gratitude. Caleb returned one Saturday, carrying a long object wrapped in a bedsheet. He had become an apprentice sign carver, and now wore his hair tied at the back with a leather cord. Sawdust remained in the seams of his coat. He removed the sheet. The new sign was carved from walnut salvaged after the storm. Across the top, Caleb had cut Bell and Barrett in letters modeled after Silas's original sign. Beneath them were the words, "Leather Strops, Repair and Finish." A smaller board hung from 2 brass hooks at the bottom. "Daughters." Jude ran his thumb through the final letters. "Are no daughters working here?" he said. Caleb unfolded a copy of the 1903 tintype. Doris had shown it to his mother, who had remembered another photograph of Ruth Bell repairing razors behind the cafe during the flood of 1903. "There was one," Caleb said. "The old sign forgot her." They hung the sign that afternoon. Jude left the original E-Bell board inside above the stretching frame. Its tilted holes, rust stains, and single surviving chain remained unchanged. The new sign did not correct every silence. It corrected one. That winter, Jude began a letter. He chose heavy paper, sharpened a pencil with Elias's paring knife, and wrote beneath the green glass lamp, "My dear one, whoever you are." He explained the roof, the chimney, and the trust without turning any of them into accomplishments. He recorded the names of the people who had helped, the sources of the leather, and the pressure required to set a copper rivet without bruising the grain. He included no instructions about whom the shop should belong to. He wrote only that the next keeper must repair tools for workers who could not replace them, and must leave the granite slab in the cellar closed, unless a later letter gave a reason to lift it. At the bottom, Jude added the date, but did not sign. He left a blank line beneath his name for another hand. Before sealing the envelope, he crossed the room and tested the finished strop once more. The leather moved beneath the razor spine with the slow, honest resistance Malcolm had taught him to recognize. It reminds the edge what shape it was meant to keep. Outside, evening gathered along Coldwater Creek. The restored windows held a low amber light. A package waited beside the door for Monday's mail, and fresh snow began covering the old demolition marks near the rear wall. The leather Razor-Strop shop waits. It has always waited. At the county office, Loretta Farrell kept the blue-stained dollar in the back of her desk drawer. The paper had softened along its folds, but Washington's face was still visible beneath the ink. Whenever someone asked what a condemned building was worth, she touched the closed drawer before answering.